8-year-old girl tells her father she is being mistreated by her stepmother, and when her father hides in the attic to expose her, he discovers something worse than he imagined. Before the story begins, comment below which city you're watching the video from. We love getting to know our viewers. And of course, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss more exciting stories. Enjoy the story and see you soon. The sound of the alarm clock filled the silence of the house as Marcos got up, carrying the same weight he had been bearing since that fateful night. It had been just over a year since he lost Anna, his wife, in an accident that now seemed increasingly distant. But the pain remained present, like a shadow. Carolina, his 8-year-old daughter, was still asleep, and he hesitated for a moment before entering her room. The little girl was curled up in her bed, hugging the teddy bear Anna had given her last Christmas. The room reflected the childhood Carolina was trying to preserve. Lavender-colored walls, drawings stuck here and there, and toys scattered around. Marcos knew that she missed her mother too, even though she rarely spoke about it. He took a deep breath before waking her with a kiss on the forehead. "Time to get up, little one." Carolina slowly opened her eyes, and for a moment, the childlike sparkle that used to light up her face appeared. But as quickly as it came, it disappeared, replaced by an empty look. "Is it already day?" she asked, her voice hoarse from sleep. "Yes, and we have a busy day ahead. I promised pancakes, remember?" He tried to sound cheerful, even though he knew they were both pretending. The morning followed its usual course. Marcos made coffee, Carolina ate in silence, and the routine seemed like an automatic dance, devoid of emotion. He knew something needed to change. Grief had turned their home into a cold place, and he feared the impact it would have on his daughter. It was precisely this fear that had made him accept the support offered by the social worker assigned after the accident. And today would be the first meeting with Angela. Angela arrived promptly at 10, a gentle smile lighting up her face as she introduced herself at the door. Her brown hair was tied up in a bun, and there was something reassuring about her posture. She seemed to listen more than she spoke, a trait Marcos immediately appreciated. "Marcos, it's a pleasure to meet you. I hope I can help both of you through this difficult time." Her voice was calm, almost maternal. Carolina peeked from behind the hallway door, her curiosity evident, but she lacked the courage to approach. Angela noticed but didn't push. She knew how to handle children like Carolina. "Everything in its time," Angela remarked, casting a compassionate look at Marcos. Throughout the meeting, Angela asked thoughtful questions, listening to Marcos's story and the challenges he faced as a single father. She suggested activities that could help Carolina open up more, like art or gardening, and recommended that they spend more time outside, away from the constant reminders of Anna. Before leaving, Angela kneeled in front of Carolina. "You know, I'd love to get to know you better. Maybe next time we can play or paint something together," said Angela, handing the girl a small set of colored pencils. Carolina hesitated, but eventually accepted the gift with a murmured thank you. Marcos felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe, with time, they could become a happy family again. In the following days, Angela became a regular presence. She helped Marcos organize Carolina's routine, brought ideas to make the house more welcoming, and even cooked for them on occasion. To Marcos, she seemed like an angel sent to ease his pain. However, Carolina did not show the same enthusiasm. While she was polite to Angela, there was something in the girl's gaze that didn't escape Marcos's attention. He attributed it to the natural difficulty of adapting to change and continued to believe that Angela was exactly what they needed. One night, while tucking Carolina into bed, he asked, "You like Angela, don't you? She's been very good to us." Carolina took a while to answer, her eyes fixed on the ceiling before murmuring, "She's good to you. Marcos furrowed his brow but didn't press her. He thought it was just a matter of time before Carolina got used to it. After all, he himself was starting to feel something deeper for Angela. Perhaps, he thought, this was their chance to rebuild what they had lost. Meanwhile, in Carolina's room, the teddy bear she clung to hid the true secret. The little girl whispered things to it that she couldn't tell her father. The days turned into weeks, and Angela seemed more and more integrated into the household routine. Her presence, always kind and helpful, was like a balm for Marcos, who was beginning to feel that life was finally moving forward. Angela helped with household tasks, organized games for Carolina, and often suggested new ways to alleviate the emotional weight that father and daughter carried. Despite this, Carolina remained hesitant. She made an effort to be polite, but there was an almost imperceptible resistance, something Marcos attributed to the difficulty of adapting. He couldn't deny, however, that this tension bothered him. One Saturday morning, Angela appeared with a radiant smile, carrying a bag full of paints, brushes, and large sheets of paper. "I thought it would be fun to do some art today," she said, as she unpacked the items from the bag and placed them on the dining room table. "Do you like painting, Carolina?" The girl, sitting on the couch with her gaze fixed on a storybook, responded without enthusiasm. "Sometimes." Marcos, noticing the lack of excitement, intervened. "Come on, little one, it's going to be fun. I can try too. Maybe I'll paint something you can hang in your room." Carolina looked at her father and, reluctantly, walked over to the table. Angela seemed determined to win the girl over. She spent a few minutes explaining simple painting techniques and encouraging Carolina to express herself freely. "There's no right or wrong in art," Angela said, while painting a sunflower. "The important thing is to have fun." The girl began to draw with careful strokes, but her expression remained closed. Angela tried to cheer her up, commenting on the colors she had chosen, but Carolina seemed indifferent to her enthusiasm. When the session ended, Angela looked at the drawing, a small house with a distant female figure, while a man and a child stayed together in the center. "Did you draw your family?" Angela asked, smiling. Carolina nodded without looking at her, focused on putting away the brushes. "It's beautiful, but where am I?" Angela laughed, trying to sound casual. "You don't live here," Carolina replied simply, before leaving the room with the drawing. Marcos, feeling uncomfortable, tried to smooth over the situation. "She still misses her mom. It will take time for her to open up, but I'm sure she likes you." Angela smiled, but there was something in her eyes that Marcos couldn't decipher. Later, that same day, while Angela and Marcos were washing the dinner dishes, she gently broached the subject. "Carolina is a smart girl, but it might be a good idea to set some boundaries. I notice she's still stuck in the past. This might hinder her emotional progress and yours too." Marcos stopped for a moment, reflecting. "Boundaries? What do you mean?" "Just some small changes," Angela explained. "Encouraging more independence, maybe. It's normal for children to try to keep us tied to what they know, but that's not healthy. I want to help you both build something new, you know?" Marcos nodded, but felt a slight discomfort. He trusted Angela, but her words seemed a bit harsh. Still, he chose not to contradict her. After all, she was the expert. As the days went by, Angela began to make subtle decisions about the house dynamics. She rearranged some spaces, arguing that a renewed energy would help Carolina. The girls' room underwent small changes, such as replacing some toys with books and educational games. Although Carolina didn't directly complain, Marcos noticed that his daughter spent more time in silence. One night, before bed, he found Carolina lying down, staring at the ceiling. "Is everything okay, sweetheart?" She looked at him, her big, serious eyes. "Why do you like Angela so much?" The question caught Marcos off guard. "Because she's good to us," Don't you think? Carolina didn't answer immediately. After a few seconds, she murmured, "She's not good to me." Marcos laughed, thinking it was just childish jealousy. "Of course she is. We just need to give it time. I know this is hard, but it will get better, I promise." Carolina turned her back to him, clutching the teddy bear tightly. Marcos thought it was just grief still manifesting. However, had he looked more closely, he would have seen the tear silently sliding down his daughter's face. Marcos woke up that Monday to the sound of the alarm clock louder than usual, as if even it knew it would be a complicated day. He got up carefully to avoid waking Carolina, but as he passed by his daughter's room, he noticed she was already awake. Sitting on the floor, she hugged her teddy bear, staring out the window with a distant look. "Good morning, little one," he said, trying to sound cheerful. Carolina didn't answer. She just looked at him with a mixture of exhaustion and something that seemed like fear. Marcos kneeled beside her. "Is everything okay? Did you sleep poorly?" She hesitated before nodding. "Just a nightmare," she replied, but her voice lacked conviction. He sighed and decided not to push. Carolina had always been reserved about her feelings, something that had intensified after the loss of Anna. He stood up, tousled her hair affectionately, and promised pancakes for breakfast. Angela arrived later that day, with her usual contagious energy. She brought a bag full of new educational materials that, according to her, would help Carolina express herself better. Carolina showed no enthusiasm and preferred to retreat to her room while Angela and Marcos discussed the day's plans. "She'll get better with time, you'll see. Children need routine and security, and I'm here to help," Angela said, smiling reassuringly. Marcos nodded. He appreciated the effort Angela made to connect with Carolina, even though the girl continued to resist. Later, while Angela helped prepare lunch, Carolina slowly came down the stairs, holding a folded piece of paper. She stopped at the kitchen door, waiting for Marcos to notice her. "What is it, sweetheart?" he asked. "I want to show you something," Carolina said, looking directly at Angela before quickly looking away. Angela smiled, but Carolina didn't return the smile. Marcos took the paper and unfolded it. It was a drawing. There were 3 human figures, a child and a man together, and a distant woman with a severe and somber face. "Is that you and Angela?" he asked, confused. Carolina didn't answer. Instead, she turned and quickly ran upstairs, leaving Marcos uncomfortable. He looked at Angela, who was watching the scene in silence. "It's just her way of processing things," Angela commented naturally. "I really don't mind, as long as she's expressing herself." Despite the calm tone, there was something in her posture that seemed tense. That night, while putting Carolina to bed, Marcos decided to address the subject. "Sweetheart, what happened today? Do you want to tell me about the drawing?" She looked at him, serious. "I don't like her," she murmured softly, as if afraid to be overheard. Marcos tried to smile to reassure her. "Why not? She's so nice to us. She's always trying to help." Carolina hesitated. Her fingers played with the teddy bear's ear, a gesture that Marcos recognized as nervousness. "She's not nice when you're not here." The statement hit Marcos like a punch to the stomach. He frowned, trying to understand. "What do you mean by that?" "She calls me annoying, and other things. She says I only get in the way, and—" Carolina paused, her voice growing even softer. "She said you like her more than me." Marcos felt a knot in his throat. Was this real, or was it just a misunderstanding from Carolina? He knew children could misinterpret situations or exaggerate, but something in his daughter's tone seemed sincere, as if she'd been holding this in for some time. "Sweetheart, are you sure?" he asked, more seriously now. She nodded, but quickly turned her face into the pillow, refusing to say more. Marcos sat beside her for a few minutes, his mind racing. He tried to rationalize. Maybe it was just Carolina's grief manifesting in a confusing way. Maybe she was just jealous. But what if it wasn't? When he returned to his room, he found Angela sorting through some papers at the desk. She smiled when she saw him enter. "Is Carolina okay?" she asked, with a tone of concern that seemed genuine. "She's fine," Marcos replied, though not very convincingly. "I think she's still adjusting." Angela sighed. "It's normal. I've seen this before. Give her time, and everything will work out." He tried to relax with those words, but he couldn't. Something in his heart told him there was more to this story than Angela was willing to admit. Marcos parked the car in front of a small cafe in the city center. The rain was falling lightly, and the sound of the drops on the windshield filled the silence as he stared at his phone. He had sent a message to Ethan, his old childhood friend, asking to meet. It was rare for him to seek advice, but his concern for Carolina consumed him to the point that he saw no other option. When Ethan walked into the cafe, exuding confidence and wearing a worn-out jacket, Marcos felt an immediate sense of relief. His friend was a private detective, someone who always seemed to have an answer, or, at the very least, a plan. "Marcos, long time no see," Ethan said, shaking his hand before sitting down. "What's the urgent matter?" Marcos hesitated for a moment before unloading everything. He told him everything. Anna's death, Angela's entrance into their lives, Carolina's resistance, and finally, the frightening words his daughter had whispered the night before. Ethan listened in silence, his eyes attentive and his face expressionless. When Marcos finished, he remained silent for a few seconds before speaking. "Marcos, I'll be direct. I've dealt with cases of relationships like this. Sometimes a person seems perfect on the outside, but there's something wrong inside." He paused. "Do you trust Carolina?" The question hit Marcos like a stone. He wanted to believe, but at the same time, he feared he might be misinterpreting everything. "I don't know," he admitted. "I want to believe, but at the same time, Angela seems so nice. What if Carolina is just jealous?" Ethan shook his head. "Never underestimate what a child perceives. They have a sharp instinct for things that we adults ignore. If she says something is wrong, it's better to pay attention." Marcos lowered his gaze to the coffee cooling in his cup. "What do I do then?" Ethan smiled faintly, but it was a serious smile. "First, you observe. No confrontations, no alerting anyone. Let's find out if something is wrong. If Carolina is right, we'll have proof. And if she's not, at least you'll have peace of mind." Back home, Marcos felt torn. He trusted Ethan, but the very act of suspecting Angela felt like betrayal. When she arrived that evening, bringing a pie she had made for dinner, he tried to hide his tension. Angela noticed. "Everything okay? You seem distant." "Just tired from work," Marcos replied, forcing a smile. Angela approached and placed her hand on his shoulder, her touch light and reassuring. "You need to rest more. I'm here to help, remember?" Marcos nodded, but Ethan's words echoed in his mind. "Observe, without alerting anyone." In the following days, Marcos began noticing small details he had previously ignored. Angela always seemed to know how to act in his presence, but there were moments when her smile disappeared briefly, especially when she was with Carolina. He also noticed that the girl avoided being alone with Angela. Once, when he asked Carolina to help Angela with the dishes, she hesitated so long that she needed to be convinced. "I just don't like doing the dishes," Carolina said, but her tone seemed forced. Marcos watched from afar as Angela tried to engage Carolina in conversation. There was something about the social worker's posture, a stiffness, an impatience masked by a smile, that bothered him. But without proof, everything felt paranoid. Ethan contacted him again after a few days. "Install some cameras. Nothing invasive, just to observe while you're away. I want to make sure everything is as it seems." Marcos hesitated, but eventually gave in. He bought a few discreet cameras and installed them in strategic spots around the house, especially in the living room and kitchen, where Angela and Carolina spent most of their time together. It was an action that made him uncomfortable, but he knew it was necessary. That night, while reviewing the first footage, Marcos found nothing alarming. Angela behaved exactly as she always did in his presence, sweet, attentive, almost maternal. Carolina, on the other hand, seemed withdrawn and silent, but that could have just been the lingering grief. But then one recording caught his attention. It wasn't anything scandalous, but enough to make his heart race. Carolina was sitting at the table drawing, while Angela was tidying something in the kitchen. At one point, Angela looked at Carolina and said something inaudible, but the expression on the girl's face changed instantly. Her shoulders hunched, and she lowered her head as if she had been scolded. Marcos turned up the volume, but the audio was too low to catch what was said. However, that moment stuck in his mind. There was something wrong. He just needed more time to figure out what. The next morning started like all the others, but Marcos felt that something had changed. He couldn't get the scene from the recording out of his head. Carolina's defeated look, Angela's firm expression. As he prepared the coffee, he watched his daughter playing with her cereal, moving the spoon without really eating. "Did you sleep well?" he asked, trying to sound casual. Carolina nodded but didn't lift her eyes. Angela came downstairs shortly after, carrying a notebook and the same warm smile as always. "Good morning," she said, as if nothing could be wrong. Marcos responded with a murmur, still trying to decide how to deal with the suspicions growing in his mind. He needed more information before confronting her. That afternoon, while Angela went out to take care of some errands, Marcos seized the opportunity to talk to Carolina. He found her in her room, drawing as usual. The paper in front of her showed a blur of dark colors, a contrast to the colorful drawings she typically made. "Do you want to talk, little one?" he asked, sitting at the edge of the bed. Carolina paused for a moment, gripping the pencil tightly. "About what?" she replied, without looking at him. "About you and Angela. You said you didn't like her, remember?" The girl looked at him with big, serious eyes, full of hesitation. It was as if she was struggling with something bigger than herself. "She said you like her more than me," she whispered finally. Her voice was so soft that Marcos almost didn't hear her. He felt his stomach twist. This was the second time she had said it, but now it seemed more direct, more real. "Why do you think that? What exactly did she say?" He tried to stay calm, even though his heart was racing. Carolina took her time to respond, her fingers fiddling with the pencil's tip. "She calls me a liar when you're not here, and she said that if I keep being annoying, you'll want to be with her all the time." That sentence stabbed Marcos like a knife. He took a deep breath, trying to stay calm so he wouldn't scare his daughter. "She said that? When?" he asked, his voice becoming firmer. Carolina nodded. "Yesterday when you left. And sometimes she looks at me in a bad way, like she wants me to disappear." The girl started to cry quietly, hugging her teddy bear tightly. Marcos enveloped her in an embrace, feeling the fragility of his daughter's small body. He believed her, but he also knew he needed concrete proof before confronting Angela. "I'm here, my love. I'll always be here, okay? No matter what happens." He tried to sound as convincing as possible. Carolina just nodded, hiding her face in his shoulder. Later that night, while Angela was in the bath, Marcos reviewed the recordings from the day. He found another unsettling moment. Carolina sitting in the living room with Angela, trying to show a drawing. Angela looked at the paper with disdain and murmured something inaudible, but enough to make Carolina lower her head and quickly hide the drawing. The scene ended with Angela returning to her smile and casually commenting when Marcos walked through the door as if nothing had happened. It was the pattern. When he was around, Angela was the perfect figure. When he wasn't, there was a tension that he could no longer ignore. The next morning, Marcos decided to talk to Ethan again. He knew he needed help to gather clearer evidence. Angela had already earned a place in their lives, and it would be difficult to distance her without concrete proof. "I'll need something more elaborate," Ethan said on the phone. "Something that captures audio. If she's really saying these things, we need to hear it. I can set that up for you." Marcos agreed. He knew it was a risky step, but a necessary one. Meanwhile, the relationship between Angela and Carolina seemed to grow more tense. Carolina avoided any direct interaction, while Angela began insisting that Marcos take firmer action with his daughter. "She needs discipline," Angela commented that night as Marcos put away the dishes. "She's too spoiled. It's not her fault, of course, but I think it would be good to establish some rules. It would help her grow." Marcos simply nodded, pretending to agree, while his mind worked at full speed. He knew he was getting closer to the truth, but with each step, the weight of the responsibility grew. His priority was clear: to protect Carolina, no matter what it took. The next morning, Ethan arrived at Marcus's house with a small, discreet case. He looked at his friend with seriousness, making it clear that the situation now required precision. "Here it is, small microphones that you can place in strategic spots," he explained, opening the case to show the devices. "Combined with the cameras, you'll have both audio and video. You'll be able to know exactly what's going on." Marcos took the equipment with trembling hands. The idea of installing those devices made him feel invasive, but the worried look in Carolina's eyes motivated him to move forward. He knew he needed proof. Without it, Angela could easily deny everything. "I'll do it tonight," Marcos said, "while she's distracted." Ethan nodded, but placed a hand on his friend's shoulder before leaving. "Be careful, Marcos, and remember, if Carolina is right, every day counts. Don't let this drag on." That night, while Angela was in the bath, Marcos began placing the microphones. He chose strategic locations: the living room, the kitchen, and Carolina's room. He installed everything carefully, making sure the devices were well hidden. His heart was racing, but he finished before Angela noticed anything. Carolina watched everything from the hallway, silently. When Marcos finished, she called him to her room. "Dad, do you believe me?" she asked, clutching her teddy bear tightly. Marcos knelt beside her, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "I believe you, sweetheart. I'm here to protect you, and I'm going to find out what's going on. I promise." Carolina sighed, as if that answer was the only thing keeping her calm. The following days were filled with growing tension. Angela seemed to sense something different in Marcos's behavior, but didn't directly say anything. She continued playing the role of the perfect partner, cooking, helping with Carolina's chores, and suggesting new activities for the family. Marcos, in turn, reviewed the recordings every night. For a while, it seemed like Angela was flawless, as if she knew she was being watched. However, on the third day, he found something that made him stop. In the living room recording, Carolina was sitting on the sofa, holding a book. Angela passed by her, and without noticing she was being recorded, said in a harsh tone, "I've told you not to leave your things lying around. Do you think this house is just yours? Your father should teach you to be more grateful." The girl remained silent, but her hunched posture spoke louder than any words. Later, in the kitchen, Angela made an even more disturbing comment. "You know, your father deserves someone who really supports him, not a spoiled child who only knows how to complain." Marcos clenched his fists as he listened, feeling a rage he hadn't experienced in a long time. There were no shouts or direct insults, But Angela's words were cold, manipulative, and clearly aimed at undermining Carolina. The next day, Isabel, the elderly neighbor, appeared at the door. She was a frequent presence, always bringing cookies or homemade cakes for Carolina. However, today, she seemed worried. "Marcos, can I talk to you for a moment?" she asked, glancing briefly at Angela, who was in the kitchen. Marcos nodded and invited her in. "What's going on, Isabel?" The woman hesitated before responding, as if deciding whether she should get involved. "I don't want to cause trouble, but I've heard shouting and crying coming from here a few times, especially when you're not home. I thought you should know." Marcos felt his heart race. He thanked Isabel and reassured her that he was aware of the situation and taking care of it. The neighbor, although still worried, seemed calmer as she left. That night, Marcos confronted Angela subtly. During dinner, he casually mentioned, "Isabel said she's heard some noises from here when I'm out. Any idea what it could be?" Angela stopped for a moment, the spoon in her hand freezing in midair. She quickly composed herself, but there was something in her eyes that indicated surprise. "It must be Carolina. She's been more emotional lately. Maybe she's crying by herself. I tried to help her, but she's still closed off." Marcos nodded, without giving any indication that he knew more than he was letting on. Inside, however, he was more certain than ever. Angela was hiding something, and he was about to expose the whole truth. Marcos woke up that morning with a sense of urgency. The recordings and the reports from Carolina and Isabel confirmed that something was deeply wrong, but he needed more. It was as if every day with Angela was a ticking time bomb. The situation became even more complicated when Angela brought a new presence into the house. "This is Amelia, a friend of mine," Angela said, introducing the woman who had just entered the door. Amelia was thin, with an angular face and a penetrating gaze. She wore elegant clothes, but there was something in her posture that seemed intimidating. Carolina was in the living room with her teddy bear, and upon seeing Amelia, she hugged it tighter, discreetly retreating to the corner. "It's a pleasure to meet you both," Amelia said with a smile that seemed more rehearsed than genuine. Marcos smiled politely, but something about the interaction made him uncomfortable. Angela rarely mentioned friends, and now a strange woman appeared, behaving as if she had already become part of their routine. During the visit, Marcos watched from a distance. Amelia and Angela were talking animatedly, but every now and then, Angela would cast quick glances at Carolina, as if monitoring the girl's behavior. Carolina, in turn, seemed uneasy, fidgeting with her teddy bear and avoiding any eye contact. At one point, Amelia turned to Carolina and asked in an almost authoritative tone, "Do you help your father around the house, dear? I think it's important for children to learn responsibility from an early age." Carolina didn't answer. Angela quickly intervened. "Carolina is still learning. I always say she needs to be more collaborative." The girl lowered her head, visibly bothered. Marcos felt a tightness in his chest, but remained silent, trying to process what he was witnessing. Later, Marcos called Carolina to her room. He needed to know what was going on. "Have you seen this woman before?" he asked. Carolina shook her head, but then hesitated. "Only a few times when Angela thought you wouldn't be home soon. They laughed at me." "Laughed at you? What do you mean?" Marcos asked, trying to control his tone so as not to scare her. "They said I'm a problem, that you'd be happier if I were more obedient, or if I wasn't here." His daughter's words sent a chill through Marcos. Amelia wasn't just a casual friend. She seemed to be an accomplice to Angela. Carolina's behavior made it clear that the two of them formed some kind of alliance against her. That night, while reviewing the recordings, Marcos found what he was looking for. During a conversation between Angela and Amelia in the living room, Angela casually but cruelly commented, "Marcos is so in love that he doesn't see anything. Carolina can be so unbearable sometimes. She just knows how to get in the way." Amelia laughed and responded, "It's just a matter of time before he realizes that you're trying to improve his life. He should thank you." Angela sighed before finishing. "Sometimes I think it would be easier without her, but I've invested too much in this to give up now." Marcos paused the video, his anger rising inside him. It wasn't just Angela who was a threat. Amelia was encouraging her behavior, reinforcing her actions and words. The next day, Ethan showed up again. Marcos told him about Amelia and played the recording. Ethan listened in silence, but his expression hardened with every passing second. "This changes things, Marcos. It's not just Angela manipulating. This Amelia is an important piece. If Angela is trying to solidify a place in your life, Amelia is clearly encouraging it." "What do we do now?" Marcos asked, frustration evident in his voice. Ethan thought for a moment before replying, "Keep collecting evidence. Now we have the audio, and it's incriminating, but I want to know how far this goes. Don't confront them yet. They can't know you're aware of everything." Marcos nodded, though the weight of inaction weighed heavily on him. Everything inside him wanted to protect Carolina immediately, but he knew Ethan was right. He needed a solid plan. In the following days, Angela continued bringing Amelia into the house more frequently. The two of them grew more comfortable, as if they had already become part of the routine. Carolina, however, became more withdrawn, preferring to stay in her room or in the backyard to avoid any interaction. Marcos observed everything, every word, every glance. He knew he was getting closer to the moment to act. Angela and Amelia were getting too confident, and that would be their undoing. He just needed to be patient, for Carolina's sake. That Saturday morning, Marcos woke up more tired than ever. The recordings, Carolina's words, and the increasingly unsettling presence of Amelia were consuming him. He could barely hide his unease. As he prepared coffee, he looked out the window and saw Isabel in the yard next door, tending to her plants. Something in the neighbor's calmness encouraged him to seek her out. He needed an outside perspective. Soon after, Isabel knocked on the door, bringing a freshly baked orange cake. I thought Carolina might like something sweet today," she said, smiling warmly. Marcos accepted the cake, but his worried expression caught Isabel's attention. "Is everything okay, my son? You look like you're carrying the weight of the world on your shoulders." He hesitated, but eventually invited Isabel inside to sit at the kitchen table. After a few minutes of conversation, he decided to share part of what was going on. "I'm worried about Carolina. I think Angela may not be who I thought she was. And now there's this friend of hers, Amelia. Things don't seem right, especially for my daughter." Isabel furrowed her brow, thoughtful. After a few seconds of silence, she sighed. "Marcos, I was actually thinking about talking to you about this. I hear screams, crying, when you're not home. It's been bothering me." The statement made Marcos's heart race. "Are you sure? What exactly did you hear?" he asked, leaning forward. Isabel looked at him seriously. "Often it's Carolina crying. Sometimes I hear Angela and that friend of hers laughing or talking loudly. At first I thought it was just something small, but now I see it's not. Carolina seems so different lately, more quiet, more sad." Marcos clenched his hands tightly, feeling anger bubbling up inside him. Isabel placed a hand on his shoulder. "Marcos, I know you're a good father. You need to protect your daughter. If something's wrong, don't ignore it." He thanked the neighbor for her concern and promised that he was handling the situation. As Isabel left, she turned to him one last time. "Carolina is a special girl. I'm here if you need anything. Don't hesitate." Later, Marcos reviewed the recordings from the cameras and microphones he had installed. What he found only reinforced what Isabel had said. Angela and Amelia, alone in the living room, were talking about Carolina. She's so dramatic, Angela commented casually. She cried just because I asked her to clean up the mess in her room. Can you believe it? She's like that because Marcos has spoiled her too much. He doesn't see how manipulative she is. Maybe we should be more firm, Amelia replied, as if analyzing a strategy. Angela laughed, a cold and unpleasant sound. Firm? If it were up to me, she'd have already learned not to annoy me. But Marcos has to think I'm the nice one, at least for now. Marcos paused the recording, his mind boiling. This was no longer a misunderstanding. Angela and Amelia were deliberately undermining Carolina and manipulating the whole situation for their own interests. It was unbearable to think that he had allowed these women into his life. That night, during dinner, Marcos tried to hide his anger while Angela talked about reorganizing Carolina's room to encourage discipline. Amelia was there as well, as a guest. Children need clear boundaries, said Amelia, taking a piece of bread. That's what ensures they grow up with responsibility. Carolina silently stared at her plate. Her eyes avoided any eye contact. Marcos took a deep breath before replying, keeping his voice calm. I think Carolina is doing well. She just needs patience. It's hard for a child to go through so much. Angela gave a smile that seemed to hold frustration. Of course, patience is important. But sometimes, Marcos, you need to be more direct. I just want what's best for you all. Marcos didn't respond. Instead, he looked at Carolina and gave her a reassuring smile, trying to provide comfort. Later, while Angela and Amelia conversed in the living room, Marcos went upstairs to Carolina's room. He found her sitting on the bed, hugging her teddy bear as always. How are you feeling, sweetheart? He asked, sitting beside her. I'm scared, Daddy, she whispered, barely audible. He put his arm around her, pulling her close. You don't need to be afraid. I'm here, and I won't let anything bad happen. Trust me. Carolina nodded, but her eyes showed that the fear was still there. Marcos knew the time to act was coming. He had evidence, support from Ethan, and the certainty that Carolina needed him more than ever. All that was left was to choose the right moment to confront Angela and put an end to this nightmare once and for all. It was a peaceful night, but in Marcos's house, the tension was palpable. Angela seemed more at ease than ever, chatting animatedly with Amelia on the couch, while Carolina remained silent in her room. Marcos, however, was far from relaxed. The recordings, Isabel's reports, and especially Carolina's words kept hammering in his mind. With Ethan's help, he had analyzed all the evidence. Now there was no doubt Angela and Amelia were manipulating the situation to undermine Carolina and secure their place in his life. The time to act had come. After dinner, Marcos asked to speak with Angela privately. He led her to the kitchen and shut the door behind them. Angela seemed curious but calm, unaware of what was to come. We need to talk, Marcos began, crossing his arms. His tone was firm, yet contained. Sure, what's going on? Angela asked, tilting her head with a look of false concern. Marcos took a deep breath, trying to suppress the anger bubbling inside him. I know what you've been doing with Carolina. I know what you've been saying to her when I'm not here. And not just you, but also Amelia. Angela's face immediately changed. The smile faded, and an alert expression took over her features. What are you talking about? She asked, trying to stay calm, but her voice trembled slightly. Marcos continued. I installed cameras and microphones around the house. I heard everything. I heard you say that I'd be better off without my daughter. I heard your cold and cruel words. And I heard Amelia encouraging you to be even worse. Angela took a step back, her eyes wide. She tried to regain control. This is absurd, Marcos. You're paranoid. Carolina is a problematic child, and all I've done is try to help both of you. She's manipulating you, and you can't see it." Marcos slammed his hand on the table, interrupting her. "Manipulating? She's 8 years old. What you did was cruel and unacceptable. You took advantage of my grief, entered my home, and tried to destroy my relationship with my daughter." Before Angela could respond, Amelia entered the kitchen, drawn by the raised voices. "What's going on here?" she asked, with a cold look. Marcos pointed at Amelia. "You too. I know you've been encouraging Angela to act like this. You two have gone too far, and it ends now." Unlike Angela, Amelia didn't try to justify herself. She crossed her arms and smiled disdainfully. "You know, Marcos, you should thank us. Everything we've done has been for your own good. Carolina is a difficult child, and you'd never have the courage to admit that on your own." Amelia's calculated calmness only infuriated Marcos more. "Do you think you have the right to decide how I raise my daughter? Do you think you can just destroy the trust between us? This is abuse, and I won't tolerate it for another second." Angela started to cry, but her tears seemed forced. "I just wanted to help you, Marcos. I love you. Everything I did was out of love." Marcos shook his head, incredulous. "This isn't love. This is manipulation. You used my family's grief to get close and tried to turn my daughter into a problem that doesn't even exist. You have no place here anymore." In the midst of the confrontation, Ethan arrived. Marcos had asked him to be there in case things got out of control. Upon entering the house, Ethan immediately sensed the tension. "Is everything okay here?" he asked, looking at Angela and Amelia. "It's under control. Angela and Amelia are leaving now," Marcos replied firmly. Angela looked at Ethan, then back at Marcos. She realized there was no more room for manipulation. With a defeated sigh, she grabbed her purse and started walking toward the door. Amelia followed her, but not without giving Marcos a contemptuous look. "You'll realize you made a mistake," she said. "But by then, it will be too late." Marcos didn't respond. He just watched as the two left, closing the door behind them. When it was all over, Marcos went upstairs to Carolina's room. She was sitting on the bed, holding her teddy bear, her big eyes full of anxiety. "Did they leave?" she asked, her voice soft. Marcos nodded and sat next to her. "They did, and they'll never come back, I promise." Carolina hugged her father tightly, and for the first time in a long time, Marcos felt that he was starting to regain control over his life. He knew there was still a long road ahead to rebuild trust and heal the wounds, but he was certain of one thing. He would never again ignore what his daughter was trying to tell him. The house felt different without Angela and Amelia. The silence, once suffocating, was now a relief. Marcos realized how their presence had turned the home into a place of constant tension, and he felt a renewed peace, knowing that finally he and Carolina were free from their manipulations. In the days that followed, Marcos dedicated all his time to his daughter. He took her to the park, cooked her favorite meals, and even sat down to draw with her, something he hadn't done since before the accident. Every small gesture seemed to help Carolina regain a bit of the joy she had lost. One afternoon, while Marcos was putting the dishes away, he heard a light knock on the door. It was Isabel, with her usual gentle expression and a plate of freshly baked cookies. "I came to see how you two are doing," she said, entering with the same discreet care as always. Marcos smiled and offered her a coffee, grateful for her presence. Isabel looked around the house, noticing the lighter atmosphere. "It seems like things are going back to normal," she commented. "We're adjusting," Marcos replied. "There's still a lot to process, but we're doing better." Isabel nodded, but her gaze softened when she mentioned Carolina. "She's strong, Marcos. Stronger than she seems. But it's good that you're so present now. That's what she needs most." Marcos silently agreed, feeling the weight of truth in his neighbor's words. At night, as he was putting Carolina to bed, He started a conversation he had been avoiding until then. "Sweetheart, I want to talk to you about everything that happened." Carolina looked at him, her eyes a bit wary. "I know it's been hard for you, and I want you to know that I will never let anything like this happen again. If something bothers you, no matter how small, you can tell me. Always." The little girl nodded, but this time there was something different in her face, a sense of security that Marcos hadn't seen in a long time. "I trust you, Daddy," she said, holding his hand. Marcos felt his eyes well up, but he held back the tears. He knew that despite the difficulties, they were on the right path. The next day, Ethan stopped by the house to pick up the recordings and help Marcos decide what to do with the evidence. "Do you plan to take this to the police?" Ethan asked while organizing the files. Marcos thought for a moment before responding. "Angela and Amelia are out of our lives now, and my focus is on Carolina. But I want to keep all of this safe, just in case they try something in the future." Ethan nodded, understanding the decision. "That's a good idea. And Marcos, you handled it the best way possible. It wasn't easy, but you protected your daughter. That's what matters." Marcos thanked his friend, feeling grateful for having Ethan by his side throughout the whole situation. He knew that without his friend's support, things could have ended very differently. In the months that followed, Marcos and Carolina began attending therapy sessions. It was a difficult decision for him, as he had always been reserved about his own feelings, but he knew it was essential to overcome the trauma. The sessions helped both of them process what had happened and strengthened the bond of trust between father and daughter. Carolina started to open up more, talking not only about Angela, but also about the loss of her mother. Marcos realized that, although he had tried to be strong for her, he also needed to learn to share his pain and allow her to see that it was okay to feel sadness. Isabel, true to her role as their guardian angel, became an even more frequent presence in their lives. She would take Carolina for walks in her garden, teach her about flowers, and sometimes just sit with her to chat. The little girl seemed to flourish under the loving care of the neighbor. One afternoon, while Carolina played in the yard, Isabel and Marcos sat under the shade of a tree. "You're lucky to have such a special daughter, Marcos. She's been through more than many children her age and still has that spark in her eyes." Marcos smiled, looking at Carolina. "I'm lucky to have her, and I've learned the hard way that I need to listen more. No matter how hard life gets, nothing is more important than protecting her." Isabel nodded, satisfied. "That's what makes you a good father." As time passed, Marcos realized that although he still missed Anna, he had learned to move forward. He didn't need anyone to fill the void. All he needed was to be present for Carolina. He had not only rebuilt his life, but also his relationship with his daughter, stronger than ever. That night, as Carolina slept, Marcos sat in the living room, looking at the walls that had once witnessed so much suffering. Now, they were just memories. He knew there would still be challenges ahead, but he was ready to face them. After all, he had learned the most important lesson: to listen to the people he loved, trust his instincts, and never ignore the signs that something was wrong. For Marcos, this was more than a lesson, it was a new beginning. And so ends the emotional journey of Marcos and Carolina, a story of overcoming courage and unconditional love. This story reminds us that we should always listen to the people we love and never ignore the signs that something is wrong. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and activate the notification bell so you don't miss more incredible stories like this. Your support is essential for us to continue bringing exciting content to you. Now, we want to hear your opinion. What would you do if you were in Marcos's shoes? Would you have the courage to investigate someone so close? Or would you just trust your daughter's instinct? Leave your answer in the comments. Let's talk about the most impactful moments of this story. And of course, share this video with your friends who love narratives full of twists and life lessons. See you in the next video.